revelation that the state of Virginia sterilized thousands of persons between 1922 and 72 in a program aimed at ridding the state of so-called misfits.
Yeah, if he doesn't take care of it, if he doesn't want to take care of his responsibility in this world,
sterilize the man, sterilize the woman if she's had more than 2 illegitimate children.
right?
But it's only a start. These people deserve to be compensated, just like any other victim that has had their rights violated.
Minnie, do you know what they did to you when they operated on you?
No, sir.
You still don't know today what they did to you?
No, sir.
Can't have children?
I don't know. I don't know.
How many children would you like to have?
One.
Why just one?
I don't know.
Today, we'll be discussing the case of the Relf Sisters and the very troubling history of eugenics in North America. The Relf Sisters were just like any young girls in the 1970s. They did have struggles they faced. Being Black living in Montgomery, Alabama wasn't necessarily the most easy experience, especially at the time. They were living in low-income housing. They were dealing with some disabilities that made it harder for them to focus in school or even make friends with other children. Though their parents often struggled to get on their feet, they still made sure they did everything they possibly could to allow their children to live the life that they didn't necessarily have while growing up. The only problem with the Relf Sisters is that they actually had a target on their back. Because not only were the odds of getting out of their circumstances stacked against them, but the government was actually against them as well. And this was because they were one of the many targeted in a very sick practice affecting some of the country's most vulnerable people. And it would be the perseverance they showed from this case that would kickstart a very important movement in the health and reproductive rights of Black girls and women across America. But before we get into this case, just to introduce myself, my name is Petal Palmer, and on this channel I post anything medical, mysteries, history, and crime. If that is something that sounds interesting to you, please consider subscribing if you end up liking this video. All right, let's get into this case. Before we talk about the Relf Sisters, which honestly just blew my mind the more and more I researched it, we're going to talk about the history of eugenics and how something as sick as this even started. Eugenics is defined as the study of how to arrange reproduction within a human population to increase the occurrence of heritable characteristics regarded as desirable. It comes from a Greek word meaning good in birth or noble in heredity. So this meant as close to whiteness as possible or as close to being able-bodied as possible. They wanted to do whatever they could to eliminate those in the society that they thought were ruining the world with their horrible genetics. And included in this group of social ills was Black women. While eugenic practices were found to be a thing dating back to ancient Greece, the modern eugenics practice that gained large popularity started in 1883 by a man named Francis Galton. Francis Galton was born February 16, 1822 in Birmingham, United Kingdom. He was known as something called a polymath, and this was because he had knowledge in multiple fields of study. He studied anthropology, psychology, biology, and even meteorology. And he just had a long list of schooling, publications, achievements, and all of that. He was quite the educated man, and it was with this knack he had for education and learning that he started the study of eugenics, which was actually inspired by famous scientist Charles Darwin. If you don't know who Charles Darwin is, he was the man who created the theory of evolution by natural selection, which was outlined in his work called On the Origin of Species, published in 1859. This theory of evolution by natural selection essentially explains how organisms that have heritable traits or characteristics that allow them to better adapt to their environment are more likely to survive and reproduce, and thus pass on those same genes that aid in their survival. This essentially weeds out organisms that don't have traits that will aid in their survival. For example, it was found that back millions of years ago, some giraffes used to have short necks. But throughout time, those giraffes with the shorter necks started to get weeded out because having a longer neck was a more desirable trait to be able to reach the food in the trees. So the longer neck giraffes were essentially like, you know what? I'm mating with another longer neck giraffe. Their kids were like, I'm mating with another longer neck giraffe. And this continued until there was no more short-necked giraffes around. So they weren't only not surviving because they couldn't reach the food as the long-necked giraffes could, but because the long-necked giraffes simply were just like, look, I'm not mating with a guy who can't reach food. I'm sorry. And boom, now we have no more short-necked giraffes. But evolution by natural selection has happened to many different organisms, whether it be size, height, color. There's been many different characteristics that have been weeded out over time. If you ever heard the term survival of the fittest, that's what this is, the fittest. Those were the ones who survived. And this is the theory that Charles Darwin discovered. Now, Francis Galton just so happened to be Charles Darwin's cousin. And Francis was just so moved by Charles's work in the On the Origin of Species book that he just had to continue studying and developing new findings off of that theory. To be exact, the first chapter of the book was something that he found particularly interesting. This chapter was titled Variation Under Domestication, and he was interested in what it said about animal breeding. Francis read this chapter and he just had this new outlook. He was so fascinated by all of this and he wanted to figure out a way to continue studying so that he would be able to add his own ideas onto it. For those next few years, he continued reading, he came up with research programs, and it was the year 1883 he coined the term eugenics, also known as race theory, in his book titled Inquiries into Human Faculty and Its Development, which, fun fact, is free to read on Google. Francis observed how in evolution, animals who survived were those who had the more desirable traits. But he recognized that a theory like this didn't necessarily apply to humans because unlike animals, humans didn't necessarily choose someone solely based on physical characteristics. Humans, for the most part, choose people that they actually like. And because this choice isn't solely based on physical characteristics, there are many different humans with different traits, and there's just this large variety of people in the world, which you would think is great. You know, it's nice knowing that we're not all the same and we all have these different traits that we inherited. But in the 1800s, this was actually a problem, a big one at that. And Francis was quite determined to find a solution to that. He knew that natural selection didn't work for humans like it did for other organisms. And the issue with this was that there were a lot of characteristics back then that people thought were the worst possible characteristics for humans to have. In America, especially at the time, anyone who was not of white Anglo-Saxon heritage were viewed as strangers and blamed as the ills of society. This included not just Black people or African Americans, but it also included immigrants from South and East Europe, and it included Native Americans. They were being blamed for any issues happening in society, and their mere existence was viewed as a threat. Now, Francis, being the genius he wasn't necessarily concerned with the race of people or even their looks, but he was concerned with one thing, and this was their intelligence. He had this fear that there was going to be a decline of genius or intelligence in society, and his main goal in his discovery of eugenics was to prevent that from happening. Now, why was he concerned that intelligence was in decline? Well, Francis believed that intelligence was an inherited trait, that to be intelligent, you had to come from a line of people who were intelligent. And he believed that those who were the most intelligent were those who were of the upper class or those who were highly successful and accomplished people. There was one big problem, though, and this was that Francis discovered that those who were giving birth at a higher rate just so happened to be those who were poor or of lower class. So who was going to be populating the world more? Those who were poor. And what was the problem with those who were poor? They weren't intelligent. And what did this mean for evolution? Unintelligent people were just going to continue reproducing unintelligent people until the world just got rid of all the geniuses and was just filled with people who were not smart. And this was why he came up with eugenics, which he defined in 1883 as the science of improving stock, which is by no means confined to questions of judicious mating, but which takes cognizance of all influences that tend in however remote a degree to give the more suitable races or strains of blood a better chance of prevailing speedily over the less suitable than they otherwise would have had. And in 1904, to him, at the end of the day, morals aside, in any organism, there were good traits and there were bad traits. There was something that was more suitable and something less. Whether that was somebody being sick versus healthy, whether that was being frail versus strong, whatever it was, something that everyone could agree is that there was something that was better than the other. In his case, what he thought was important was being intelligent versus being not. And he wanted to set up future generations in a way that would allow them the most success as they continue reproducing and contributing to the world. He spent the next couple decades trying to test his theory and figure out how to make these changes. One thing he tried was conducting a test to measure intelligence, which was a fail because those who were poor did just as well as those who were rich. So he just concluded that something was wrong with the test and that his theory still held true. He then tried testing pea plants, but found that some offspring were better than the parents and some were worse, again, disproving his theory. But he still held true to his beliefs up until January 17, 1911, when he passed away, and his beliefs did make their rounds across the world amongst many different societies. In 1904, a German biologist named Alfred Plotz coined the term racial hygiene, and this was a term leading to the authorization of persecutory eugenic policies, especially in Nazi Germany. He created the Archive for Racial and Social Biology, which was the first journal containing information primarily focused on racial hygiene and eugenics, and emphasizing the superiority of the Nordic or Aryan race. This led to the Society for Racial Hygiene being formed in Germany in 1905, as well as the Eugenics Education Society formed in Britain in 1907, which, by the way, is still a real thing. They're just now called the Galton Institute, which was only changed in 1989. It was through the information spread from these organizations that places like Germany began implementing policies like mass sterilization and even making it a crime for Jews and non-Jews to get married in the 1930s. And of course, America had to get on this new eugenics wave themselves. In 1903, the American Breeders Association was founded, now known as American Genetic Association, or AGA. It was initially started to study the laws of breeding and to promote the improvement of plants and animals by the development of expert methods of breeding. But there was a man there named Charles Davenport. He was a well-known biologist from Harvard, and he was like, look guys, there's this new thing. It's called eugenics. I think we need to add this in our organization. And they were like, oh my, like, yeah, we should add eugenics. And that was when it was introduced to the States. Big problem with Charles Davenport and pretty much most eugenicists, to be honest, he was a giant racist and classist. Surprise, surprise. A lot of the research he conducted, he backed with racist and classist claims. In fact, just to give an example, the National Academy of Sciences has a biographical memoir of Charles Benedict Davenport created by Oscar Riddle, highlighting Charles' eugenics creed, which states things like, quote, I believe in striving to raise the human race to the highest plane of social organization, of cooperative work, and of effective endeavor. And I believe in such a selection of immigrants as shall not tend to adulterate our national germplasm with socially unfit traits. It was more than just race or class. He made great efforts to do things like implement stricter immigration laws. He believed that immigration in itself was a biological problem. And he even maintained a pretty strong connection with a lot of Nazi institutions and publications in the 1930s. All in all, his main purpose in his studies seemed to be doing what was possible to scientifically justify a lot of the social or political beliefs he had. He didn't like immigrants. Okay, cool. It's a biological issue. This is all based on science. When in actuality, none of it was. But he stayed true to his beliefs, whether it be about race, class, the support he had with Nazism. He remained firm in his beliefs up until the end of time when he passed away from pneumonia in 1944. It was with his persistence and stubbornness, if you will, he played a significant role in increasing funding for genetics research. which fueled his success with all these ideas. And it was only over time a lot of his work began getting criticized by many in the scientific community. Now, as eugenics policies began expanding in the US, scientists had two types of approaches to getting this ball rolling. There was something called positive eugenics, and there was something called negative eugenics. With positive eugenics, the idea was simple. Those who were of the white or fit race were encouraged to reproduce, have as many children as possible, and continue growing so their race could expand and hopefully be in the majority. All right, cool, that's their prerogative. Nobody's directly harmed in that. Now, on the complete opposite side of that was negative eugenics, and this involved the direct elimination of those who were of the inferior or unfit race through any means, including forced sterilization. He wanted to get the ball rolling on eugenics laws being passed in the United States, and fortunately for him, that did in fact happen, because in 1907, it was when the US passed its first compulsory sterilization law in the state of Indiana. With this law, the state mandated the sterilization of anyone in state institutions who they deemed as idiots, imbeciles, or those who they grouped as certain classes of criminals. And it said that women were sterilized if they were deemed feeble-minded or promiscuous. Because to them, being the oh-so-smart pioneers, they were believed that these traits were genetically inherited, despite there being absolutely nothing to back up such claims. And it wasn't just Indiana who implemented this law, because by the 1930s, there were a whole 30 states who had passed sterilization laws, and thousands of people who were negatively affected by this. Because for some reason that is beyond me, many of these states kept these sterilization laws not just for a couple years or even a dozen, but these states held these laws for decades, sterilizing over 60,000 people in the process. There were eugenics organizations forming. The first International Eugenics Congress was held in 1912. By the end of World War I in 1918, eugenics organizations expanded to countries like Hungary, France, Italy, Argentina, Mexico, Czechoslovakia. And while these countries had their eugenics practices and principles specific to their country, America also had their own principles. Not only were they trying to rid all the feeble-minded idiots, but they had this racial ideology, and that was that those who were of the white Anglo-Saxons race were in fact the superior race. So anyone who was further from being that, there was a pretty good chance they wanted them to be sterilized. By the 1930s, many prominent scientists were openly critical of the practice of eugenics. They thought it lacked scientific merit and pointed out the flawed experimental designs of it. These critiques were especially strong after World War II, when Nazi Germany began implementing forced sterilization against Jews, which was inspired by America's sterilization laws. But the wildest thing is that even though scientists were getting weary around 1930s to 40s after World War II, the last forced sterilization in America occurred in the state of Oregon in 1981. 1981. There are people who are alive today who were directly affected by these forced sterilization laws. And some of these people included two young girls known as the Relf Sisters. 12-year-old Minnie Lee and 14-year-old Mary Alice were the youngest pair out of their 6 siblings. Born to parents Lonnie and Minnie Relf, they grew up in Montgomery, the capital of Alabama, a 156 square mile large city highlighted by its humid and subtropical weather, but mainly known for being the birthplace of the Civil Rights Movement. Built in 1835, Montgomery housed the first White House of Confederacy. And over a century later, it was in this city where some of the most notable moments in the Civil Rights Movement occurred. It was March 2nd, 1955, when 15-year-old high school student Claudette Colvin was arrested after refusing to give up her seat to a white woman on a crowded and segregated bus. And 9 months later, on December 1st, 1955, when Rosa Parks, too, was arrested for the same thing, which shortly became a poster moment for the Civil Rights Movement, one of the most popular ones that people hear about. They taught us about Rosa Parks in elementary school, but Claudette Colvin was someone I only heard about later on my own time. And this wasn't even ages ago. Claudette is still alive, and well at 84 years old today. And Rosa Parks passed away on October 24th, 2005 at 92 years old. Both women, very important people in the civil rights movement, playing especially notable roles in the Montgomery bus boycott from December 5th, 1955 to December 20th, 1956. And in more recent times, we know this as the site of the oh-so-iconic Montgomery Riverfront Brawl. Anyway, Lonnie and Minnie, who were the parents of the Relf children, were no strangers to hardship. They grew up on farms in Macon County, which is a rural area a little over 9 hours away from Montgomery, located in east central Alabama. And not only just being Black, but being poor during the mid-1900s left them with difficult challenges. They weren't able to do a lot of the things those who were more fortunate were able to do. The early 1900s was peak Jim Crow era, so this was when white supremacy was at an all-time high. Several segregation laws. I mean, Jim Crow laws started around the 1870s and lasted all the way until 1965. So being Black around this time in the States, as you can imagine, wouldn't have been particularly easy. Both Lonnie and Minnie lacked the means and resources to do many things children needed while growing up. They grew up in poverty. They had no access to an education. They both couldn't read. They couldn't write. And they often struggled to find meals and would go many days hungry because, like several others, many times they didn't have the means to get things like food. They didn't have a large support group. The people they knew were the people in their community, and they were in the same predicament as them. It was actually described that the only ounce of support they felt like they had came from the social workers that they would see, which they described as the welfare. And they were in general stripped of many opportunities to enjoy what most in the States would consider these simple things in life. And it especially didn't help that at some point, Lonnie ended up getting into a very bad car accident, which left him with a debilitating back injury. So already not being able to read or write, but now not even being able to do any physical work, he was having a hard time finding a job. So that was why, after many years of being together and having all of their children, they were excited, for lack of a better word, to be able to move to Montgomery for what they hoped would be a better environment to raise their family in. Instead of living on their farm, they would now instead live in this big city. And this was perfect because unlike the farm where there was pretty much no resources, they would now have access to things like subsidized housing with a rent of only $25. They had food stamps, and they were even being offered a monthly $156 welfare check through what was called Community Action Program, or CAP, under the Montgomery Community Action Committee, or MCA. The Montgomery Community Action Committee was an organization founded in 1965 in order to aid families living in poverty in the Montgomery area. It was funded by the Office of Economic Opportunity, or OEO, and it was through this program that the Relf family was moved out of the shack they lived in to instead live in a public housing complex while being directed access to government assistance programs. And of these programs included a federally funded family planning clinic called Montgomery. Now, while the Relf family was glad they were able to have a place to stay while trying to get back on their feet, a lot of the services provided through MCA were definitely not ones that seemed to have their best interest at heart. As part of their stay in the public housing, the Relf daughters were required to attend regular appointments at the Montgomery Family Planning Clinic. These appointments were required for all three of them, 12-year-old Mary Alice, 14-year-old Minnie Lee, and 17-year-old Katie. Now, this seems harmless, right? 3 young girls being given access to family planning services they otherwise might have not been able to have access to? Wrong. It was during these appointments at that clinic, Katie was subjected to unsolicited injections of an experimental birth control, and they were doing these injections without even asking her parents' permission to do so. Not only this, but these injections of this experimental drug on this child was fully supported and approved by the FDA, which was odd because this experimental birth control contained something called Depo-Provera, and the drug itself wasn't yet FDA approved, but they were in full support of the experiments being done mainly on underage and young Black women who were poor. And it wasn't too long after when these experimental drugs were being used on Mary Alice and Katie as well. Over 11,400 people were subjected to this testing, and many of them reported severe side effects. So bad, the drug was actually completely pulled from the market during the summer of 1973. Additionally, not too long after these unsolicited injections began, the clinic was up to more yet again, because in March 1973, they inserted contraceptive intrauterine device, or an IUD, for Katie, all without requesting the approval of her parents. But if you thought that was all, unfortunately it's not, because all of these actions were just smaller steps in the bigger plan they had for these young girls. On June 13th, 1973, a hot summer day in Montgomery, 12-year-old Minnie Lee and 14-year-old Mary Alice suddenly heard a knock on their front door. Their father, Mr. Relf, wasn't home at the time, but their mother, Mrs. Relf, was. So when she headed over and opened the door, there stood in front of her was a nurse from the family planning clinic. The nurse said hello. Mrs. Relf said, hey, is everything all right? And this was when the nurse told her, yeah, everything's all right. We just need to take the girls to the clinic to get some shots. Now, court documents say that the parents were aware that the girls were being given shots at the clinic. It doesn't specify what the shots were for that Mrs. Relf knew the girls were getting. But during this interaction, she was just under the impression that these were just the shots they were being given already when they were going to go to the clinic that day. So Minnie Lee, Mary Alice, and Mrs. Relf all hopped into the vehicle, and the nurse brought them to the doctor's office. Katie was not with them as she wasn't home at the time, so it was just the two youngest girls and their mom. At the doctor's office, none of them, not even their mother, ended up speaking to the doctor at all, and it wasn't too long after when they were transported from the doctor's office to the hospital. At the hospital, Minnie Lee and Mary Alice were assigned a room, and once in the room, staff members came up to Mrs. Relf with a paper in hand, and they said to her, hey, I'm just going to need you to sign this form. Now, like mentioned, Mrs. Relf could not read or write. And because she was already used to constantly coming to the clinic for the girls to get their shots, nothing was alarming to think that there was something out of the ordinary going on during this visit. They've done this many times before. They were conditioned to trust the medical professionals because at the end of the day, these were the people giving them access to proper housing, food, medical treatment. These were the people who had their best interest at heart because they were never used to getting help from anyone else. So when the staff member came up to her like, hey, we just need you to sign this, Mrs. Relf was like, oh, okay, yeah, like I'll sign this form so my daughters can get their shots. That's keeping them healthy. So Mrs. Relf, not being able to read or write, was shown where to sign, crossed off the area with the letter X, and it was after she signed this, they escorted her home. Now, when Mrs. Relf left the hospital, Minnie and Mary Alice were brought into a ward where they were left by themselves. And after a little while of being inside this ward, a nurse came inside and said, hey, Minnie, you know what? I'm going to need you to sign this document for me. And you want to know what the document was for? The document was a completely false document stating that Minnie was over 21 years old and that she gave consent to what was about to happen. We are talking about a 12-year-old child here. Minnie was very confused. She didn't understand what this document was talking about, nor what she was supposedly authorizing consent for. And again, she still had yet to meet with a physician in the first place, and none of the staff members had even explained to her what they were planning on doing to her or her sister. After a few hours had gone by, Minnie was beginning to feel extremely nervous, so bad to the point she actually got out of bed, went up to another patient in the ward and asked them like, hey, would you mind if I borrowed some change from you? It's really urgent. I really need to call my mom. Thankfully, the other patient said, of course, and handed Minnie the change to call her mom. Now, in their housing, the Relfs didn't own a telephone, but thankfully one of their neighbors did. So Minnie called their neighbor, who fortunately picked up, and she asked, hey, is it okay if you put my mom on the phone, please? I really need to talk to her. The neighbor said, of course, went over to Mrs. Relf, brought her over and put her on the phone. This was when Minnie expressed to her mom she really wanted to go home and asked her if she would be able to pick up her and Mary Alice from the hospital. But unfortunately, this is when her mom told her, I'm so sorry, but I have no transportation to pick you girls up from the hospital. So to Minnie's dismay, she and her sister had to stay there awaiting the unknown. Because it was still during the night, they were completely unaware of what the hospital had planned for them, which was very unfortunate because it was that next morning when the unthinkable happened to Minnie and Mary Alice. Because it was that next morning when both girls were wheeled to an operating room, placed under a general anesthetic, and surgically sterilized, all without their consent. Neither Minnie, Mary Alice, nor Mrs. Relf had spoken with or even seen the physician who performed the surgery prior to it happening, and at no point did any physician inform the girls or their parents about the possible risks or side effects of a procedure like this. There was a complete lack of informed consent or shared decision-making in this process. They presented the form to Mrs. Relf knowing she couldn't read, and instead of explaining to her that her daughters would be surgically sterilized, they allowed her to sign off on the form under the impression that the girls would just be given their regular shots. In fact, the clinic didn't only have this plan enact for Minnie and Mary Alice, because they actually had the plans to do the same to Katie as well. On that same Wednesday, when Minnie and Mary Alice were brought to the hospital to undergo the sterilization procedure, the same nurse who transported them there came back to the Relf home that afternoon looking for Katie, which, to the nurse's luck, Katie was in fact home this time, all by herself. And the nurse kind of just gave her the same spiel. She said, hey, I'm going to need to take you to the hospital so we can do some health things on you. Don't worry, your sisters are getting it done too. Just very vague information, but essentially just trying to lure Katie out of the home. But Katie was not having any of it. She was all alone. None of her parents were there, neither her sisters. And there was this grown adult trying to take her to the hospital for who knows what. So Katie quickly closed the door, ran through the hallway, and locked herself in her room. She fully refused to go, and she just wanted the nurse to leave her home. So the nurse, of course, gave up and left, and Katie was saved from the forced sterilization being done on her. That day, after Minnie and Mary Alice had the procedure involuntarily done on them, their father, Mr. Relf, tried going into the hospital to see his daughters. But for some reason, the staff members told him, hey, it's past visiting hours, and they refused him access. And both girls were left to stay in the hospital for 3 days before they were finally discharged and allowed to go home. Now, it was only when they got home when Mr. Relf was with his daughters and he couldn't help but notice something odd on their bodies. Because when he looked at them, all he saw were clear signs of surgical scars. At that moment, he was very confused because they were all under the impression that they were going to be given their regular shots. Why on earth would they have surgical scars on their body? It was then when Mr. Relf quickly called their social worker and was like, hey, I think something strange happened to the girls. Can we please meet to get this sorted out? It was during this meeting with the social worker when they were just left completely shocked because this social worker informed them, hey, I'm sorry to say, but Minnie and Mary Alice had been sterilized while at that hospital. And it wasn't too long after finding this out when the Relf family got to taking legal action. They filed a class action lawsuit in the federal district court with the help of the Southern Poverty Law Center.
Minnie, did you want to have the operation?
No, sir.
Do you want to have children?
Yes, sir.
Was it embarrassing for you when you went back to school?
I don't think so. Yes, sir.
How did you feel about it after the operation was over and you had found what they'd done to you?
I felt bad. I felt kind of bad. After I got through taking the operation, it was sore a little bit. When I woke up about 4 o'clock that evening. Then when I felt the pain, it was pain. And then she came in and gave me a shot. Gave me 4 shots.
Did they ever tell you what they were doing to you?
No, sir.
Did it hurt you?
She said it hurt when she woke up. Then when I first went in there, I started getting dizzy. Started laying down. Then I was scared. And then I started falling out.
Why were they giving you the shots in the first place?
They keeping us from having children. They said they didn't want us to have no children. That's why they told us that. They used to come out here every day and give them to us at our house.
Was that a problem? Did you really need the shots?
No, sir. They told me they were They told me for keeping having children. That's all they told me. They ain't said nothing else about it. And then they started operating on when we was when I was down at my brother's house. They came down there and got me from down there.
Were they giving the shots to other children here?
No, sir.
Why did they pick you out?
I don't know.
The lady told you that the shots were to keep you from having children, and there was no problem. Why did you agree to it?
I don't know.
Were you frightened of the lady?
Yes, sir.
Why were you frightened?
I thought she was going to give us some shots. That's why I was scared. I thought she was going to give us an operation, then I was scared.
Did you ever talk to it? Did you ever talk about it to your mother and father?
No, sir.
Why not?
No.
Minnie, do you know what they did to you when they operated on you?
No, sir.
You still don't know today what they did to you?
No, sir.
Can't have children?
I don't know. I don't know.
How many children would you like to have?
One.
Why just one?
I don't know.
Did you know what they were going to do to you?
Yeah.
Well, if you knew, why did you go along? Why didn't you resist?
These people are so used to having white people come up to them and say, do this, do that, or do what. And when they were taken down to the hospital and were told that they were going to have an operation, particularly these girls, they simply just did what they were asked, and they did.
Why do you think they did it to them?
I didn't know. I wasn't even at home. When I come back, they had done carried them down to the hospital. That's all I know. I didn't know what they was going to do to them. They said it was going to give them shots. But I didn't know what happened. After then, they had to operate on when I know.
You didn't want the operation?
No, I didn't want the operation. Because so they didn't have some children.
Mrs. Relf, what did...
Come that Monday and told me they was going to take them down and give them shots.
What do you think about what has happened?
I don't think about that until I know them things they had them get operate on them. I went back up there the next morning.
Do you want them to have children?
Yes, and I want them to have children.
Why did they operate on your children, do you think?
I don't know why they operate on them.
Have they ever been a problem for you?
No, they haven't been a problem to me.
Why did you allow the people to come out here and give them shots if there were no problem?
I didn't allow them to come out here and give them to them. I don't think the lady told me she was going to give them shots.
How were you treated by the lady?
I wasn't treated no way by her.
But she had to ask your permission.
Well, all I know, she told me that she's going to say they wasn't going to give them no more shots out here. They're going to take them to the hospital and give them shots. That's what she told me.
You didn't go with your daughters to the hospital?
I went out there, but I didn't stay. I told them I couldn't stay out there with them.
What did you first think when you learned what really had happened to your daughters?
Really, what happened, what I think happened, I didn't know nothing about it. They didn't even tell me nothing about it. They was going to give them an operation.
But after the operation was performed and you found out about it, what did you think then?
I didn't think anything. When they took me back up that morning, they had to operate on me. They was bringing me out back up on the stretcher.
This was a $1 million lawsuit in the case titled Relf versus Weinberger. Casper Weinberger was the director of the U.S. Department of Health, Education, and Welfare, or HEW, now known as the Department of Health and Human Services, from 1973 to 1975. This case also named Alvin J. Arnett, who was the acting director of the Office of Economic Opportunity. During the investigation, it was found that there had been up to as much as 150,000 people who were poor and subject to sterilization by the federally funded programs at the time. Both Weinberger and Arnett were accused of using their power to force these individuals who were less fortunate into agreeing to these procedures under the threat of terminating their welfare benefits, leaving them with no housing, no food, or medical resources, all if they didn't get sterilized. In the end, the judge just made the HEW change its arbitrary and unreasonable regulations on procedures and ruled the federal funds could no longer be used for unwanted sterilizations. However, due to the changes made by the agency, the case was ultimately dismissed and the Relf family left with absolutely no compensation from their horrifying ordeal, which is just ridiculous because not only were they subject to experimental injections of Depo-Provera without their consent, but Katie was given an IUD without the parents knowing. And both Minnie and Mary Alice being subject to an involuntary sterilization procedure without nobody being informed about it. And life for them after this ordeal was nowhere near the same. Not only were they forced to live with the physical scars from this procedure, but they were left with mental scars and trauma. It was said that the sisters would go to school and would often be teased by other kids for now not being able to have children. It was so bad that neither Minnie or Mary Alice were able to finish high school. Even worse, it was only 7 years after this forced sterilization when their mother Minnie passed away in 1980, and 29 years later when their father Lonnie passed away in 2009. Cases like the Relf Sisters fortunately played a huge role in the anti-sterilization movement, and it was in 1981 when the state of Oregon performed the last legal forced sterilization in the United States. And there were so many cases like this. In 1961, American activist Fannie Lou Hamer was given a hysterectomy without her knowledge or consent after going in for a fibroid removal surgery. Fannie was from Sunflower County, Mississippi, and it was after this she discovered that for every 5 Black women from the Sunflower County community, 3 of them underwent unwanted sterilization. So 60% of the Black women in her community went through unwanted sterilization. It was so common for these unwanted sterilizations to happen, she actually coined the term as Mississippi's appendectomies. She was a very prominent leader in the civil rights movement and went through so much to ensure changes were made to put an end to the forced sterilizations of Black women. In the book, Killing the Black Body, Race, Reproduction, and the Meaning of Liberty, Dorothy Roberts wrote, quote, "During the 1970s, sterilization became the most rapidly growing form of birth control in the United States, rising from 200,000 cases in 1970 to over 700,000 in 1980. It was a common belief among Blacks in the South that Black women were routinely sterilized without their informed consent and for no valid medical reason. Teaching hospitals performed unnecessary hysterectomies on poor Black women as practice for their medical residents." Today, the Relf sisters are now in their 60s, and fortunately, they are all still close as ever. Despite all they've gone through, they are described as being very joyful women who radiate a positive light to those around them. Things did seem to be a bit of a struggle for them. A few years back, they were described as still living in public housing in southern Alabama and dealing with both physical and mental disabilities alongside trauma from the things they've experienced. And with the lack of compensation from this incident, getting on their feet is something that would have understandably been a difficult task to do. However, what is nice is that an organization called the Mothers of Gynecology had created a fundraiser on GoFundMe to help provide some resources for the sisters. They had a goal of raising $25,000 with the hope of bringing help to the sisters that the state of Alabama, for some reason, failed and continue to fail to provide for their several victims of forced sterilization. And as of May 26, 2023, the Mothers of Gynecology organization posted an update stating that they successfully raised $75,000 for the sisters and were able to purchase them their own house. This was a 3-bedroom, 1-bathroom home, and they said that the remaining funds were going to be used to build a privacy fence for their backyard. Now, if you haven't heard of the story of the Mothers of Gynecology, don't worry, because I will be covering that one. To briefly summarize it, it involves the story of several enslaved women who were subject to several experimental procedures, laying the foundations of modern gynecology, and the controversial physician who for a very long time held credit for it all. The Relf Sisters were also rightfully honored at the Mothers of Gynecology at their annual Anarcha Lucy Betsy Day of Reckoning conference on February 28th, 2023. They were presented with a proclamation which acknowledged the crimes against their humanity, which was issued by the city of Montgomery and their mayor, Stephen Reed. Credits given to Michelle Broder, New York Times journalist Linda Villarosa, author of Under the Skin, and Dolan Perkins Valdez, author of Take My Hand, for the work and support they put into this project. And the link to the GoFundMe for the sisters is still open, so please feel free to donate to help them out with resources if you are able and would like to. The link is in the description. In 2013, North Carolina also became the first state to provide compensation for victims of forced sterilization. Virginia followed behind them as the second state to do the same in 2015, and California became the third in 2021, as they were described as housing the nation's largest forced sterilization program, with over 20,000 victims beginning since 1909. And that wasn't the end. It was found that between 2005 and 2013, they conducted sterilizations on 144 women in California prisons through a procedure called bilateral tubal ligation, without giving them much counseling or offering alternative treatments beforehand. This prompted a new law in 2014 banning sterilizations as a form of birth control in prisons, while still allowing procedures that are medically necessary. But all in all, North Carolina, Virginia, and California are the only states to provide compensation to those who had forced sterilizations conducted on them. This is only 3 states of the 31 states, including Washington, D.C., who had legal forced sterilizations. While forced sterilizations are now illegal in the states, there are still long-lasting effects from it. Scientific racism developed from ideas like Black being the inferior race. This prompted lots of research and teachings to be rooted with these ideologies throughout time. Vance L. Bonham Jr., JD, acting deputy director of the National Human Genome Research Institute, described scientific racism as, quote, an organized system of misusing science to promote false scientific claims in which dominant racial and ethnic groups are perceived as being superior. Further adding, quote, scientific racism is a historical pattern of ideologies that generate pseudo-scientific racist beliefs, and that leading scientists across scientific institutions in the 19th and early 20th centuries were proponents of such ideologies. Eugenicists seemed to view a race or view those of a lower class and automatically assumed it was because of those attributes that they were inherently less than. What they fail to acknowledge are the structural inequities that many were presented with. In higher income areas, there were and there's still way more access to things like nutritious foods, for example. From a young age, those who are more fortunate are able to provide their children with these nutritious foods or appointments and just things that are necessary for the development of humans. Structurally, just having access to these resources plays a role in how people learn, their education, their energy levels, their quality of life. But eugenicists, for some reason, couldn't connect that, hey, maybe these people we view as inferior are already placed at a disadvantage, and maybe that's why they're more likely to have this outcome. Not, oh, they're Black and poor, they're criminals. Eugenics truthfully just seemed like a way for racists and classists to justify being racist and classist under the shield of science, because racism existed long before eugenics started, and this was just the perfect theory to justify such ideologies. That's why eventually when the general population started coming to their senses and realizing how unethical and unreasonable these practices were, several people started backing away from these ideas. While these ideas people had with eugenics still have an impact on scientific racism today, which is shown in just the implicit bias and differences in treatment of Black people or people of color often experienced by medical professionals, it's great that it's getting talked about more. And it's super important to highlight people like the Relf Sisters, who let it be known that their body was and is not an experimental playground for the government to make such decisions for. This was a case of the government thinking they had the right to determine who was worthy of creating new life, and felt like they should be able to strip that ability from someone just because they were Black or had a disability or were poor. What happened to the Relf Sisters was unethical, and it would be nice if the officials in Alabama could stop ignoring the problem and at the very least provide an apology and compensation for what they had these innocent people go through. Especially because while there's more laws put in place preventing things like this from happening on such a large and oblivious scale, treatment like this still continues too many, just now in a more discreet way. And no matter what, nothing can take away the pain, trauma, and hurt from something like this. But yes, that is it for today's video. Please let me know your thoughts below on just eugenics, forced sterilization, and the Relf Sisters case. It really is wild, but it's super important to talk about. So hopefully this video helps shed some light on these relatively recent issues. And don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss any other videos on medical cases, crime, and mysteries. Bye now.